So Larry described the three different properties or factors that influence the way a lure swims and moves when it's in the water. One of them being center of gravity, another one being buoyancy, and the other is control surfaces. He talked a lot about different types of lures and how those factors influence it. So we've just turned a simple glider shape, and we're going to start playing around with some of those factors. This is just a torpedo shape. We're going to make a mold of it, then we're going to start seeing how those different factors influence the way it swims and how it glides. Let's get started. We're going to make a simple one-piece mold, and then we're just going to cut along the top to have an area to demold and pour from. We're using these pins to suspend the lure, using corrugated plastic to make our mold box, hot melt to seal it, and then we're going to use a high strength 2 silicone rubber to make our mold. We mix a high strength 2 up 10-to-1 by weight, mix it well, degas it if you have the ability to, and then go ahead and pour it. Once the silicone is cured, we're going to break the mold box away and remove the cured rubber. Pull the pins out, and then use an X-Acto knife or an Excel knife to cut the mold to be able to remove the master in an area that we're going to be able to pour Alumilite resin into. Here we're using Alumilite white. We've used 2 ounces of A, 2 ounces of B, and then we're going to add 2 ounces of microballoons to it. This will give us 4 ounces of resin, 2 ounces of microballoons for a 50% fill by volume. We're going to mix this up thoroughly until it's all nice and blended, and then simply pour it into our mold. Once we have a good mix, we're going to over pour it slightly. Once we've over poured the resin, make sure we have all the volume or that cavity filled. Now we're going to just use some paint sticks, put a couple little quick clamps on there to clamp the mold back together. Less than 10 minutes later, we pull out our first cast. We trim the flash and the little holes where the pins were located. We'll sand this up quickly, and we're ready to start putting it in water and see how it's going to float. We're marking the top of this where that top seam line was. Now we're ready to put it in water. So when we put this in water and we spin it, the heaviest part will go to the bottom. Well, if we filled this with 50% microballoons, how do we know that that 50% is going to float to the top? Well, during the open time, where the resin is still liquid, the resin will sink to the bottom. The microballoons are going to float to the top. So even that slight separation in the microballoons during the open time will act and affect the center of gravity. Therefore, it will keel, but it's very, very, very slight because there's such a slight weight difference between the bottom and the top. Now we're going to drill our holes and put our eyelets in. Once we do this, we know this is going to impact that center of gravity. Let's see what it looks like in the water. Now it still spins fairly easily, but it keels much quicker because that weight is pulling it down. Let's see what split rings do to it. Same thing, it happens even faster. And as I'm sure you can assume, as soon as we put hooks on it, it's going to happen even faster. Now let's see how it's going to float with the hooks on it. We have a slightly nose up posture, which is pretty decent. But once we throw it in the water, you can see that it is gliding back and forth. But we have a slightly tail up posture to this. It glides pretty well, but once in a while it'll dig deep under the water. You see the tail up posture is kind of perplexing. The tail up posture of this was the interesting point. As we move the hook to the back, we know this posture is going to change. Let's see what it looks like in the tank. Moving that hook back makes the torpedo much higher. The nose comes up much quicker now. In the water, however, it's much flatter and the nose isn't diving up quite as severely. You can see it's gliding much further than when we had the hook moved forward. Now we're going to move both hooks to the rear placements. This is once again going to change that center of gravity and how the lure reacts when it's trying to float. Let's see what it looks like in the tote first. This porpoise is much quicker as the weight is now in the back. The result is a much tighter walk, where the back end is kicking out much faster because it has a lot more drag. So it gives you a much tighter, what I would consider more of a walk rather than a glide. You can see the tail down posture to this as it walks as well. So the real question with all three of these is, why is it acting different in the water than it was in our tank? If you can see, this was the position of the hooks where it was gliding the farthest, but it had a very nose up posture. What we didn't account for was the weight of the swivel, the leader in the line. Look at the difference on how this rises when you add the weight of the swivel. If we go back to the original hook placement that we thought was going to glide the best, it's just a slight nose up posture, which was terrific. But as soon as we add the weight of the swivel, the orientation changes drastically because the center of gravity is changed. Now let's look at the rear hook placement. It's still torpedo's nose up, but not nearly as quick once we add the swivel. So how did buoyancy, center of gravity, and control surfaces work on this lure? Control surfaces a little bit. The hook placement where the drag is created will impact it a little bit. Buoyancy didn't really change because the buoyancy of the bait was the same pretty much every single time. But the center of gravity was the key to this lure and the way it performed in the water. With the hook placements in the back, it would walk. It would not really glide. Once we got it balanced, we were able to get this thing to glide much further. To summarize the center of gravity, we looked at a lot of different things. Number one, just the center of gravity that the bait has by itself when we're casting, say, with 50%. We also looked at the weight and where we add the weight, from the hook eyes to the line tie position to the weight of the leader, and specifically how small adjustments make such an incremental difference. Now let's take a look at buoyancy and how that plays a role into it. Here we're going to start with two different amounts of microblooms, which is going to change the buoyancy. When you talk about buoyancy, we talk about specific gravity. Specific gravity relates to the weight of something compared to water. A specific gravity of 1 equals the weight of water. So anything with a smaller specific gravity will be lighter and will float. So if we take a look at this chart, this was made by Steve Hauser for us years ago, and he compared different specific gravities of different materials and how they related to water. Here you can see different foams, different cast resin foams, as well as the different percentages of microblooms. This helps us relate different materials to our cast materials so we can create the best specific gravity and bait that we want. So how do we relate this to our lures? In this example, we're going to mix 30% microblooms into our resin. It's going to give us a higher specific gravity and will make the bait float less because the specific gravity is going to be closer to 1. In another example, we're going to use 100% microblooms, which is going to drop the specific gravity dramatically, and it's going to want it to float more like a maple or woods that are commonly used for lures. Once we put the hooks and the line tie on, you can see how this is going to want to float in the water, being 100% microballoons. We drop it in and it instantly floats to the top. The reason is, if we have a buoyancy that's very, very high like this, there's a force working up as we're trying to pull it, and it has less tendency to glide, making this bait want to simply walk rather than glide to the left and to the right. Now let's look at the 30%. When we first put the 30% in the water, the center of gravity is dramatically off and it stands up vertically. We know we need to change the hook placement to balance this so we get the correct center of gravity for this buoyancy. Once we get the correct center of gravity for the buoyancy, so the axis is where we want it, we're ready to test these in the water. It's tough to see this out in the water, but if you look really closely, you can see it gliding much, much farther in the water. After a few times of it gliding, we're noticing that it's falling out. It's either dipping down, sometimes it's porpoising up really, really quickly. But the glide that we're getting in the water, the travel that we're getting in the water is very, very good. Matching the buoyancy close to the specific gravity of water will give you the optimum amount of glide. So we've examined how the center of gravity and buoyancy work on a bait. But how do the control surfaces work? We figured out that we have the center of gravity fairly good, so it's not completely off kilter or off axis. We have the buoyancy dialed in to either help us walk a bait or glide a bait, depending on what we want it to do. But what do the control surfaces matter? You saw in that last example in the lake where we were throwing it out and we were getting the bait to glide a long distance with not a lot of effort, but it was rolling out or spinning and then it would go off axis, maybe kilter up. What are the different things that vary the control surfaces, and how can we adjust those control surfaces to give us more stability? A couple things. First, the line tie. Moving this ever so slightly up or down will drastically change the way this lure works and the stability of it. The next point is we have this torpedo shape, but what could we do to add some stability to reduce the roll, or vice versa, the lift? One of the things that we can do is add lateral stability by possibly adding either a fin off the left and the right that needs to be positioned perfectly in the center of gravity, on that center of gravity line, that's not going to alter the axis. One way to do this is to take a fin or maybe an acrylic lip and add this to the bait somewhere to give us some of that stability. So then when it is pulled, it doesn't have a tendency to roll, because that's going to hold it in that stable position, similar to what an airplane wing does. So one way to do this is to put a fin or an acrylic lip in the back side of this to give us some control, so it will actually glide more stably and it won't have the lift. But very, very small adjustments, once again, with the center of gravity makes a big difference. Let's see what this does for us. Here what we're going to do is we're going to take our 30% microballoon fill that we know we have the center of gravity and the buoyancy where we'd like it, and we're going to cut a slot in the back, perfectly center line, and we're going to add an acrylic lip to give us some of that stability. First we cut it, we sand it out so we make sure our lip fits well, and then we simply take some super glue and super glue it in there, making sure it's as centered and as straight as perfectly as possible. Cutting this slot and adding the lip may adjust the center of gravity. So you may have to adjust the hook placement or your weight distribution of your hooks to offset this lip. But let's take a look at what this looks like in the water. Here you can see the bait is gliding much farther and much more balanced than it was without the lip. We're getting a little bit of porpoising on the nose where sometimes it wants to shoot up, and that may be a slight adjustment of the nose, or when maybe we alter the forehead of the lure so that it'll dig down just a little bit and it'll walk a little bit easier. So to summarize the three things that Larry introduced us to as far as the factors that influence the way a lure is designed and how it performs, specifically being center of gravity, the axis in which it sits in the water, the buoyancy, whether it floats or sinks compared to water, as well as control surfaces, even the really incremental things as far as the position of the line tie and if it's positioned vertically or horizontally, you know, the control surfaces that we add to help influence the stability or the instability of the bait. All these things make a huge impact, especially just looking at a simple bait like a glide bait. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. If you have any questions, please contact us on MakeLure.com.